Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of Fully Supported, episode 11 to be exact, and yes, it is Thanksgiving. While I'm posting this episode, probably it's going to not be Thanksgiving anymore because I'm sure I'm going to post this after midnight. But regardless, happy Turkey Day to those who celebrate it. And if you don't, well, you don't. And I'm sorry, for those that don't. You missed out on a lot of great food. Anyway, today's episode is going to be about 2D and 3D hollowing, and we're going to go over the differences, pros and cons of each type of hollowing system and why you should probably decide which one you want to use long before you start working on your model. There are some big differences. 3D hollowing, essentially you're going to go over to your prepare tab, you're going to go to hollowing 3D, and you're going to choose your thickness and your quality. Thickness and quality are going to determine the wall thickness as well as the quality of the internal geometry. This will kind of change depending on how high the quality you want. So for example, I usually use 4, and you'll notice that when I turn this up to 4 from 1, it's going to make the internal structure look a lot cleaner. The reason I do this is because I try to make the internal structure as smooth and clean as possible, so it gives me some nice areas to add my drain holes. Oftentimes when you do it at a low quality, you don't get those flat planes that I'm looking for on the inside to lay down the holes, and it becomes a little bit trickier to lay down your holes. Now, the major pro with doing 3D hollowing is that you have full control. You can hollow the model, choose your thickness, put your holes in, punch them out, create caps, keep the holes, don't keep the holes, whatever you want to do. Pretty much it's in your hands. You get to choose it. You can export the model as an STL that's hollow with holes in it, the whole nine. With 2D hollowing, that all goes away. You can't do a lot of those things, and it's really only software driven. So there are a lot of differences right off the cuff that you will notice when you start using the different systems. Now, commonly I use 3D hollowing because I just tend to have a better track record with it, and in my opinion, it's a little bit smoother to use, and I don't have to worry about Lychee Slicer's virtual hole system, which oftentimes creates either failed supports or just puts holes in and they don't necessarily get recognized, so sometimes they fail to create and then you wind up with a model that doesn't have holes in it. This has happened to me before. Now, it's not common, and usually it's a fault of the user, maybe not making enough space or whatever the fault was, but sometimes this error won't surface right away, and then you export the model, everything seems fine, and then the hole didn't actually get created. So again, 3D modeling, in my opinion, works really well because you don't have to rely on virtual holes, you don't have to rely on the actual internal lattice system, and you have full control over what you do both internally and externally for the model. Like I said, you can even create caps and keep them in order to fill those holes later on. But if you want to do something that has a little bit more flair and less, workaround, because technically 2D hollowing allows you to do something that you can't do with 3D hollowing, and that is the fact that it does the internal support structures for you, and that's essentially the latticing system that I'm talking about. Now, if we go over to the hollowing 2D section, we turn that on, you can see there it also has thickness and dimming and a couple other features as well. Dimming I don't usually mess with, although you can turn it off completely. I keep the intensity down pretty low. I usually keep it at its default, which I believe is between 30 and 34%. I don't usually touch it much beyond that, except for maybe to turn it off. I don't use the dimming function, and I'm not really 100% sure what its purpose is, because all it seems to do is dim the supports inside the model a little bit to make them look slightly lighter white color. And I don't know why you'd want to dim these supports, but here we are discussing it because it's an option. But again, if you go over to your 2D hollowing tab, you can specify the internal structure, you can do single lattice, you can do double lattice, and then, of course, just like normal, you will have to apply your drain holes. And unlike the 3D hollowing, you don't have the ability to punch these holes out. They will have to stay virtual holes, just like this, and you'll have to have Lychee Slicer verify that they will work before you can export the model, because you definitely don't want your 2D hollowed model to have problems. And as you can see, one of them has a verification issue, which I have to fix. There we go. Anyway, the point of this is that you would do this as an internal structure. The holes would do your drain holes just like they normally would, and don't mind that weird hole in the back of the skull. I'm going to remove that eventually. and the internal lattice would take care of the internal supporting. Since this is a skull, it has a rounded top, it would make sense to definitely support the dome as the top gets created. There's going to be some islanding there for sure. There's also suction around the eyes, so you want to make sure that there's enough internal supports on the bottom to make sure that nothing pops off or falls off the supports while that stuff is printing. The internal lattice will definitely help you avoid that. Will it catch all of your internal islands? I don't know whether that actually works properly or not, to be honest, because I have had failures with 2D hollowing before and it not actually working or catching things as it's supposed to, where the internal structure will collapse. Now, I don't know if that's because that's just how it works and that model just wasn't really built for 2D hollowing like that, or it could have been another issue internally that it just didn't work properly or didn't transfer over to the printer right. Either way, my past experience with 2D hollowing has been pretty dang awful, to be honest. And I don't really recommend using it to a lot of newer folks that are doing 3D printing. I only really recommend this as something if you really want to save time on internal support structures. And if that's the case, I actually have a couple of suggestions to help you do it that will avoid you using 2D hollowing altogether. Because although it's not a terrible method to hollow your stuff, 3D hollowing is more efficient, much more controllable, and in my opinion, the end result is usually about 100 times better. So, keeping all this in mind, I just want you guys to remember that when you make the decision to hollow, how you choose to do it will actually have an outcome, like a consequence on the way the actual print comes out. It's not necessarily mean it's going to fail, and I don't think 2D versus 3D has like a higher, risk of failure and stuff like that. But I do think that there are some caveats that you need to take note of when you're working with 2D hollowing versus 3D hollowing. And again, some of these, the pros for 3D hollowing are you have control. You're able to make your holes, export the model. The cons are that you don't have internal support structure and you are fully responsible for making sure that that is internally supported. 2D hollowing, your pros are that you have the internal lattice structure and that your internal model is fully supported for the most part. Yes, you should still check for islands. No, I don't think 100% the lattice is going to catch every single island by default. But I still think it's important to make sure that you check for islands anyway and make sure that all your internal and external stuff is supported properly. With 2D hollowing, it's a little bit more difficult to tell if that's been done, whereas with 3D hollowing, I can physically go up and down through the slices and I can see if I've done what I need to do both internally and externally. And to be honest, that is the biggest reason why I choose 3D hollowing over 2D hollowing almost every time. So for those of you that wanted to know the differences between 2D and 3D, essentially they both work pretty much the same. Your model gets hollowed out and you have drain holes in it. The major differences are that the 2D hollowing creates an auto lattice system which is automatically implanted into the model and you have less control over what goes on inside the model itself. The 3D hollowing allows you more full control, but you are responsible for creating the internal support structure inside your model, including making sure that any islands or any surfaces that need to contact supports are fully supported before you print it. Because I mean, obviously those are important points. But some of the things I don't like about Lychee's virtual hole system is that sometimes the supports will collide slightly with the edges of it, and I have actually seen where a tip will just completely fail and just poke into the hole instead of actually being supporting. So those are things that you do have to consider as pros and cons as well. The supporting structure and the hole structure is a little bit different between 2D and 3D. But the major difference is being that you have more control with 3D hollowing, less control with 2D hollowing, but the pro there is that with 2D hollowing, the lattice structure inside the model is created, whereas with 3D hollowing, it is not. So I hope that answers the questions of what the major differences between 2D and 3D hollowing are, and for those that were considering using either or, I definitely recommend going with the 3D hollowing, especially if it's the first time you've experimented with slicing and 3D printing, because it has a little bit more user control, where you're able to punch those holes out, you can keep the caps, all kinds of stuff that the 2D hollowing options don't present. So again, I really recommend going with the 3D option, and see how that works for you. Again, make sure you have adequate drain holes. Always make sure you have at least 2 drain holes in each area to allow both air and fluid to pass because only having one drain hole sometimes will cause you still to have suction if that hole gets clogged or has too much fluid in it at one particular time. You're not going to be able to get good drainage out of that hole, and then you're going to wind up with a suction cup. So always keep that in mind as well. Drain holes are also super important regardless of the type of hollowing that you're doing. So keep that in mind when you're doing your hollowing, and always make sure to add adequate drain holes where they need to be added to prevent suction cupping from occurring during the model's printing process, which of course will create more strain and pressure on the FEP, either causing it to break faster or just causing warping in the print and general just not fun stuff that you don't want to deal with. So make sure your drains are good and that they are adequate enough for the model. And you'll kind of just learn that from experience. Anyway, that is it for pretty much this episode, guys. I hope everyone enjoyed this. I hope everyone had a wonderful holiday weekend. And don't go too crazy for Black Friday, but if anyone's interested, we're doing a 65% off sale. See you all real soon.